Hello and welcome back to the Football Unravelled. We've got an interesting if fairly sombre episode for you today. It's a topic that I think is especially relevant at the moment and one that we are all quite concerned about. We're going to be exploring the influence and impact of the far right upon football. It's a topic of discussion we've intended to look toward for nearly a year now. Last year, we all saw the distressing images of far right rioters and mobs taken to the streets, fueled by online disinformation, Islamophobia, and unfettered nationalism, with a select few even attempting to burn down the refuge of asylum seekers. And unfortunately, one of the images that stuck with me came from Sunderland, when many of these rioters clad themselves in the red and white of the club, and they committed vile acts of racial hatred and discrimination, whilst representing their love of their own club and the culture. And in that instant, football became intrinsically linked with hate. But the dichotomy of this relationship, however, was reflected in the cleanup efforts that came the following day. Volunteers within the community, they also clad themselves in these very same colours, reflecting the love and tolerance of their culture and their aim to reclaim football back from hate. But this relationship between the extreme right and football is not entirely new. For over a decade now, one of the most extreme instigators of disinformation and hatred, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, otherwise known as Tommy Robinson, has utilized the passionate culture of the terraces for his own fascistic aims, supported by groups like the English Defence League and the Football Lads Alliance. And what we see now in early 2025 is the growth of far-right hatred into the mainstream. A fascistic demagogue in the White House, supported by a Nazi-saluting oligarch and robber baron in the US. The European continent, rife with nationalism, teetering on the edges of fascism. And in the UK, the shifting Overton window has nearly destroyed the oldest political party in the world in favour of the political pet project of a pound shop Enoch Powell. But is this phenomenon one that exists within a vacuum outside of football culture, or is there a tangible relationship between the passion and tribalism found within the sport we all love and the hatred that seems to have infected the UK and even the world? Well, we've got a nice panel to discuss these issues, and I'm suspecting that we're all slightly Guardian reading libs here, so it might not be the most balanced of panels, but I do think we've got an interesting conversation ahead of us. We have once again Owen Macdonald, who I know has done a lot of reading and writing on this topic in the last year, and he's additionally hosted a number of live streams and commentaries on the topic of rising fascism and hatred. How are you doing, Owen?
I'm doing very well, thank you. As you say, a slightly somber topic today, but an interesting one that's quite necessary, I think.
Yes, and perhaps brings us down to earth after the giddy heights of the weekend. You must be feeling pretty good about Fulham right now, right?
Well, exactly, right? A cup run, high on the table, pushing potentially for Europe. Could be worse to be a Fulham fan at the moment.
Yeah, Brighton and Fulham competing for the just missed out on Europe tournament trophy this year. We also have the insightful John Hyder-Wislon. How are you doing, John?
I'm good, thanks, Dan. Thanks very much. Feeling a bit battered and bruised with Palace's recent results, apart from away. But other than that, fine. And a few places lower than everybody else in the league, my team. Still mid-table, though.
Yes, not far. You'll probably still finish a point above us this year, which will annoy me.
Let's see.
And then we also have, once again, my dad. Say hello, Dad.
Hello, Dan.
The Amex looked pretty fun on the weekend. How was the game against Chelsea?
It was very, very good on Friday night. It's the first home win I've actually seen physically since November. So, guys, I missed the cup game the week before. So it was a nice change to come away feeling all upbeat. Yeah,
I heard it was pretty cold at the.
It was freezing.
Actually.
It was absolutely freezing cold. It's still cold here. Dan, you're sitting in Melbourne in 35 degrees or whatever it is, and we've got jumpers on and things.
It's been the grimmest winter for some time, not for snow, but just for grey, cold, endless weather. Horrible.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Well, I went to the beach the other day, but
Oh, thank you.
yeah. All right, let's get on to the topic of conversation then. And I think I'll go to you, Owen, first. I think you wanted to introduce us to the topic, and I think you have some interesting history that you can enlighten us on.
Thank you. I also wrote a little bit about the topic. So we live in turbulent times marked by socio-political discord and global crises. And as we venture further into the 21st century, humanity wrestles with numerous era-defining questions. One such quandary lies in political ideology. How will society react to the re-emergence of far-right sentiment to mainstream discourse and fascism upon societal structures? So fascism can be defined as an extreme interpretation of capitalism, in which capitalists in society take radically authoritarian measures to consolidate their societal power along economic, social, political, and cultural axes. The word invokes images of Nazi Germany, in which the Nazi Party's numerous atrocities have come to define colloquial understanding of the ideology. Advocates for this system are found on the far right of the political spectrum and use a range of terms to advocate for the same principal ideas. Hierarchization of society along discriminative exclusions like white supremacy, patriarchy, and cis-heteronormativity, unchecked economic freedom for capitalists to operate on the free market, the power to suppress and eliminate dissenting political positions, and the ability to define culture, drawing on favoured symbols of the past to determine what constitutes the social fabric of the present. It's in this cultural locale that we come to our topic, the beautiful game. Just as the Nazis used art and music as a means to enforce their rigid paradigm for society, the modern far-right identify football as a passion of the masses and have dug their tendrils into the world's most popular sport. We need not look far for our evidence. In August of last year, stoked by the fires of an increasingly vociferous far-right, Britain saw several days of riots mar numerous cities. Sifting through the bigotry, assaults, and vandalism, a keen observer would have spotted the prevalence of football flags and motifs across the crowds. Many rioters donned football kits and flew flags with club iconography upon St. George's Cross. Indeed, reports throughout the riots highlight the involvement of far-right football firms in the organisation and execution of the events witnessed. The Guardian, amongst others, reports a substantial increase of racist abuse and hate crime at football matches over the last decade, compounded by a staggering influx on social media sites like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram of the same vitriolic abuse. However, history tells us this isn't a new phenomenon. The petty nationalism that uglies the globe lies as intertwined in football as any setting. A nation's history can almost be defined by listening to its supporters during their internationals. Those of us fortunate to have been born after the modernisation of the sport will have avoided the era of hooliganism, violence, and disarray dogging football throughout the 20th century, in which racist chants stained matches whilst white nationalist firms made attending football weekends an active hazard. What of the FIFA World Cup? As much a vehicle for contrived national movements then as it is now, a critical mind might ask questions of Italy's triumphs in 1934 and 1938, or Argentina's in 1978, in which the influence of dictatorships loomed over their world titles. Of course, millions of football fans enjoy the sport without even considering the politics at play. Some might laugh at the idea of fascists having any presence in the most popular sport of a multicultural, globalized society, and would suggest the far-right remain a minuscule element of the topic, something for psychologists and law enforcement to deal with in their own way. This leaves us at a juncture. What is the relationship between the far-right and football, if there is one at all? Is it historical and antiquated, modern and developing, or somewhere in between? And what response should we have to it all? Perhaps we can explore some of the answers in this sociological edition of the podcast.
Very interesting. Thank you, Owen. Yeah. And I think we have this discussion on the historical relationship between the far right, but I guess also politics and football is perhaps something that our two guests on the panel who have a greater relationship with
the
historical
70s.
Football, the 70s, but also prior to that, so maybe the two of you can enlighten me and Owen, who are millennial Gen Zers, about what
it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned, just to pick up on, you mentioned correctly the 78 World Cup, and of course the 34 and 38 World Cups, which also straddled Hitler's 1936 Olympics quite neatly in the 30s. But people forget the 1970 Brazil team, although the final wasn't played in Brazil, it was in Mexico. But Brazil were under a repressive right-wing regime in 1970, and they really did use the 1970 team as a political football, if you like. It was, and yet that is the best team, often in quotes, that people have ever seen, the 1970 Brazil team. But back home in Brazil, they were under a massively repressive regime at the time, which people tend to gloss over as well. So it's certainly not new at all. But yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because, as you say, so many nations have used football as a political football, literally, a thing to motivate and inspire positive imagery of their nation, whilst at the same time utterly suppressing and crushing the freedoms of people under those nations. I think it's telling as well that even away from the most obvious dictatorships, even supposedly modern and liberal countries have used football as a way of polishing the image of the nation and unifying and draping uglier sentiments with just national flags and symbols.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly the Argentinian junta in 1978 did just that. For me, it's being a fan of a South London club that's right in the middle of a very multicultural area. The path was, it's been quite illuminating, because I started to support Palace in about 1969, 1970, something like that, and was a regular attender for many, many years before moving to the South Coast. That was all in the light of 1968 Enoch Powell, Rivers of Blood, with a lot of white working class communities supporting him, very, very vociferous. That kind of melded and morphed into the kind of National Front rise in the mid-1970s and late 1970s, aided and assisted by Margaret Thatcher and images of being swamped by alien cultures and all that kind of thing. Although Palace had black players for a very long time, and in the 1980s it transformed completely, it became something very different. There was a lot of overt racism in Palace in the 1970s, as I'm sure there was in many clubs. And this is a family podcast, so I won't use the phrases that I heard, but some really nasty stuff, even though we had a few black players emerging at that time. But I think it's all very kind of culturally situated, often in the white working class. I think coming up to date, because I'm not going to give a history lesson over the past 30 years, we haven't got time. Things like Brexit put rocket boosters on it. It enabled the rise of the far right. It's given them a huge confidence in terms of populism, fear of others, whether it be Muslims or whoever it is. People have said already, we saw the outpouring of that, into a really kind of vicious form of racism last summer, stuff we haven't seen for many generations. So I think it's always been there. It's been bubbling under the surface. It's wrong to say it's only just in the last 10 years. I mean, the 70s was a horrible time, I think, for racism after Enoch Powell with the National Front, far more overtly racist, perhaps, than some of the parties now. But it's been there. It's been with us. I think it's culturally situated quite often. I'm not just blaming white working class people, but that seems to be the epicenter, I think, of racism within football, I would say.
I know also that Oswald Mosley's fascist group, they targeted young football supporters to be part of their brigades in the early 1930s. And there are various fascist groups that would target these cultures and these groups within the terraces to promote their movements. And I think a lot of the 1960s and 70s hooliganism also kind of melded with the rise of the National Front. I mean, I read one article which suggested that it was openly okay to fly the National Front banner at matches. and it was very common to come out of matches and see the National Front even then recruiting at the terraces.
They'd be handing out
West
leaflets.
Ham in particular.
Which is quite mind-boggling. And I do think, I generally think that obviously the tribalism within football, that sense of togetherness can then bleed into an otheringness, which kind of ties into then far right nastiness. But I also think that when you get large groups of disenfranchised working class men, and when you are particularly in a period of great disenfranchisement, whether that be from 15 years of austerity, whether it be through economic downturn or various other reasons that why a group may feel disenfranchised, that often then leads to the far right, and that often then maybe leads to things like hooliganism in football. So I do think that it is a natural breeding ground for the far right, but it could also be a natural breeding ground for the left as well. In Germany, a lot of these the ultras groups, they are traditionally more left-wing, and they have a more inclusive kind of nature about them. So it's just interesting that it seems to be quite a British phenomenon that it's particularly right-wing at the moment. And, I even saw one picture of people handing out free Tommy Robinson leaflets at a Leicester game. And, realistically, that's the same as the National Front recruiting in the 1970s at these matches,
I think on the surface it's easy to say that we're not. It's different now to what it was in the 70s and 80s, and you only have to and I remember this from the 80s. In the 84 FA Cup semi-final, it was Watford versus Plymouth, and the only goal scored by it doesn't matter who it's scored by. I forget his name in the middle for Watford. John Barnes goes down the left wing. This is the FA Cup semi-final. It's on telly. You can not Wikipedia it. You can get it on YouTube. And all you can hear is monkey noises from the Plymouth fans as he goes down the wing. It's blatantly clear. And John Motson makes some sort of comment like, a bit of, I don't know whether he made it at that point, but he would commentators would say something like a bit of banter there from the opposition fans. But it's stark as Barnes goes down the wing. Monkey noises are what you mostly hear, and then the ball goes over and O'Reilly heads the ball in and Watford win the game. And that was common. That was common in those days. You don't get that now because people get thrown out. What you do get is if a black player misses a penalty in a key game, they get online vile abuse instead, and that seems to be the way it's been removed from the
it's evolved,
YouTube obvious to the it's moved with the times, I suppose.
Do you think that there is a difference? Is there a leap from casual racism, which is absolutely abhorrent, whether it be in the terraces or whether it be on, say, social media, and then actual organized far-right movements within football, such as the National Front, the Football Lads Alliance, the EDL? I am not at all excusing abhorrent racism, but I'm just wondering if what is it that makes someone going from sending terrible, really racist tweets on Twitter to say Bukayo Saka to then being organized within, say, a more vociferous movement? I'm just wondering if there is a line there, or if these are kind of out of the same thing.
I think it's a spectrum, and it's like a three-dimensional spectrum. You've got there's a term actually, stochastic terrorism, where you the means in which it operates isn't through direct sort of a person at the top of an organization sort of directly saying to you, all right, you're going to go out and do this act of hate or terror. It's through modern social media and conventions of the internet today. Hateful things are put out there and targets are made, and then people are free to act on it as and when they see fit. And with social media and anonymous accounts and easy internet access, you can do that as easily as just going online, logging onto Twitter, and just leaving a hateful comment. And there's no real, you can block the account and shut it down, but beyond that, it's the person has still received your information, and they can't not receive it unless they're actively going through their account and blocking thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of potentially hateful accounts. And I think that is it is important, therefore, to sort of say that, track the history of racism and abuse in football, but also explore how it's evolved. Because I am very fortunate. I have not been to a game where at any point I felt like in danger because of my skin. And that is a huge step forward from the 70s, 80s, 90s, where you have, as you say, the racist abuse from crowds just seen as part of banter, part of the game. I watched a fabulous documentary looking at the experience of black footballers and the lives the things they went through were awful. Bullets being sent through the post, racist chanting from their own fans when they're warming up along the touchline, like castigations from managers even for seemingly being affected by the stuff. Essentially, rather than it being treated as a hideous stain on the game, just being seen as just part of football culture in Britain. And so for us to go from there to now, when you see a game of football, it's just no one even, the person that points out there's black people on the team and makes a big thing of it would be seen as the outsider, almost would be ejected from the ground even. It's a huge step forward. But just as society moves forward with technology and ideas, racism and bigotry and the far right also adapt to it. So whilst they're not going to perhaps actively be doing hit Nazi salutes and when you're donning the National Front iconography, it adapts and changes. They have role figures on social media like Stephen Yaxley Lennon, like the dozens of just thinly veiled racist accounts which seem to always find a negative angle to cover any black footballer. The subtle but not so subtle ways that black footballers are portrayed in the media. So, it seems strange because you always think, well, how is this still going on? But the way that black footballers are scrutinized for their choice of cars and watches and how they have their money, even though every footballer basically drives a nice car and has nice clothes. But the ways certain footballers are focused on in that regard shows you there is still an undercurrent there present in the game. So I think the point around history is to identify that progress has been made, but also see it as a backdrop to show that the seeds of racism were planted and are still allowed to flourish in different forms. And through the dangerous times we find ourselves in could be given the fertilization to grow into even greater, more dangerous things.
I think that's the danger, Owen. I think that's absolutely right. And what one's seen, as you just said, is I think the overt racism, the sharp-end racism with shouting terrible things at black players on the pitch just is much, much, much less common, maybe in some areas, but much, much less common. But English exceptionalism pulls to the right. A lot of white working class men have got absolutely sucked into that. Brexit is one big deal with that, however people think it's going and all the rest of it. Let's not get into that. But that pulls to the right. And so the culture on the terraces amongst white working class men, very different to Germany, as Dan was saying, has been always something that shears to the right the whole time because of English exceptionalism, 10 German bombers, all the rest of it that we know. And while it might not be so overtly and obviously racist to individuals, at least publicly, it's still a massive phenomenon in football crowds, I think, in particular clubs. And, it's a little bit, we don't want to be too exclusive and say, oh, our clubs are fine, but it's all that lot over there. I'm sure there's elements of it at all clubs, but there are some clubs that really are outliers in that regard, that is really quite unpleasant, and where the recruiting ground for the far right is on much more fertile ground, I think.
I think it's interesting because I do agree with a lot of that. I think that the that, because it's linked to history, fascism has always relied upon young, angry men to do quite a lot of the sort of presence and footwork. Like, you could go to look at Nazi Germany. Whilst it's easy to imagine that everyone in Nazi Germany was fully committed, horrible Nazi, they had to do quite a lot of work to get rid of lots of people who opposed them before they could implement full fascism. So famously, the communist and social democrat parties were banned and their leaders and organizers imprisoned before they could win their election. Obviously, the concentration camps saw millions shuttled off and taken out of the society. And we sort of the same early implements are seen with the far right today, where even though it is absolutely the case that lots of young, angry white men are present in these groups, there's actually, if you look at them proportionally to the population, it's not a majority, and it's not a indictment of the entire working class, which is a massive, multicultural, multi-million numbered group. But as we've said, there are those places where, when pressure is applied at the right point and the far right are able to get their tendrils in, they can do a lot of work. So as you say, some clubs are in closer proximity to these groups than others because of the different social and cultural factors. So I think it sounds a bit, as you say, a bit stereotypical, saying, "Oh, well, Millwall, of course," but there is somewhat of a truth to the fact that a club like Arsenal, say, which was more had black players more prominent in the club from an earlier point, has done more with its various groups to raise for social causes and to have an inclusive atmosphere. Is going to have less ground for a far right group to come in and say, "Hey, we actually want to now promote, boo taking the knee and fly a racist plane over," than clubs that haven't had that same implementation of social justice. Equally, though, even at a club like Millwall, there are still things done in the community and still things that are there. So I think it's definitely a mix of many factors. Millwall, interestingly, it's the areas and clubs like Sunderland. We mentioned that in the sort of introduction, and other places that have had, Burnley has had an issue recently where several racist events happened. These clubs are all in areas that experience quite a lot of deprivation and don't have the social resources, and when there's not that state intervention, where there's not the money put in to help people have basic amenities and stuff, and have a sort of similar quality of life, that's where far right agitators, who let's stress are not salt of the earth working class people that are coming in from outside places, can put in their messaging and then say, well, if we just got rid of those immigrants, and if that racial diversity wasn't so far, then maybe we'd have been in a better place. And so there's I think one of the key links, that in the absence of a just and fair system, far right agitators and provocateurs can come in and start sowing their discontent.
I also think that far right and fascist ideas do often depend on this nostalgic idea of what something once was, whether it be make America great again, or whatever, or what football once was like. And I think that in English football has had massive changes go across it in recent years, whether it be the introduction of the Premier League, the mass commercialization of the league, the globalization of the league, to the extent where maybe a lot of local working class fans can't afford ticket prices. Their communities on the terraces are very different. They can't stand in the terraces because of the Taylor reforms. The culture in the stadiums maybe isn't quite as what it used to be, because there's a lot of tourists there, and maybe that mirrors often our debates about immigration in the political spheres. And a lot of the time, these changes, they're very beneficial for the Premier League. It's generated a lot of value for the Premier League. But I also think then it feeds into this idea of football not being what it used to be. And if you, that really feeds into that idea of fascism. Make football great again, I think, is probably what would resonate really well with, say, the EDL or something. And I guess I'm wondering what changes maybe Dad and John, you've seen in football over the sanitization of football. Kind of what's your experiences of that?
I think it's only at the very top level, really. I travel the country for my work, and so I will go and see Rochdale or Sunderland. I know Sunderland Championship, or Walsall or other clubs like that. That's a completely different matter. We're only really talking about the top echelon of Premiership sides that have had all those kinds of changes, and even then, I think the Taylor reforms. If you look at, we all know, don't we, that crowds stand now largely. Certainly the ultra types do, and so it's gradually reverting back to perhaps what it was 30 or 40 years ago. And the mass of football supporters that don't support the top 6 or 7 or 8 clubs, I don't think the changes have been so great as perhaps we might think sometimes.
Yeah, I think
that's interesting, John. Yeah, I mean, I came back to this country in '89, and but there was still overt racism in games when I was going up until I would say about '93 or '4. I went to a Newcastle game at Cambridge under Keegan, so it was about '92, '93. Newcastle had Andy Cole banging in goals up front, and yet there was a whole element across the back wall of the away section in Newcastle, the Newcastle fans, who booed every single black Cambridge player, Dion Dublin, etc., and made monkey noises. And as a group, what do you do? We couldn't take them on because we didn't go for a fight, and they over. It was horrible. It was horrible. It ruined the entire evening for me, and probably ruined it far more for black players or black people in the crowd. But it was still there in the early 90s. And England games, going to Wembley. I lived just around the corner from Wembley at the time. I went to see 3 games in succession in the early 90s at Wembley Stadium. And that stopped me from going to see England at home even for years afterwards. There was Ireland. The anti-Irish racism was appalling, as you kind of expect, in quotes. Then it was Cameroon, so that was overt racism, and then Germany. And I mean the absolute lunacy of a huge group next to me, knuckle dragging bunch, standing up and calling the Germans Nazis. They just didn't get the irony of that, but stopped going. And that was 91, 92. You don't get that now. It's far. And John, you're right. I don't go to many lower division games, but that kind of has been stripped away from the top level. Thankfully, because it was really, really unpleasant. It makes you stop wanting to go, actually. But it's not there now at that level. But it is obviously, but it's never far in society from. History doesn't go in a progressive way, as we're finding out in the United States, and we can lose all these advances so very, very, very quickly.
That's right.
We could do in this country just as easily as they are finding in America. I believe, we're just two, 3 missteps away from being in the same boat, and a lot of the woke agenda in football would be could easily be rolled back out again. Just if reversed. I mean, we're on a knife edge, and I think that's quite worrying.
Interesting about the woke agenda, because I think there is a sense that if it becomes too preachy, too dismissive of people who are not in that kind of elite kind of culture, as others might call it, that it can be damaging and it can be self-destructive. And I just think we've got to be a bit more open-minded about that, because I think a lot of people feel that they're being judged, they're being preached at, they're being told that they're wrong, that they can't say things. And that also encourages the rise of the far right, because they say, yeah, you're right, they're an absolute bunch of whatnots, you know, and you're right. So I do think that middle-class Guardian reading people also have to be careful not to be condescending, dismissive, and looking down on others, because it can happen very easily, and that produces exactly what we don't want to see.
I read a fascinating article actually on that topic, and sort of tying into a few things that you said, because we're all quite right. There's the Premier League is very loud and very in our face, and obviously the big football export in the country, but it is only the top silver lining of a very underfunded and disproportionately poor football league, with clubs basically disappearing all the time, running out of money, owned by terrible businessmen. I mean, I find it very interesting that we like to look at Manchester United and clubs like that as these terrible financial mishaps and all this stuff, and then you look down the league and there's clubs actively on the verge of going out of business entirely and being shut down. But I think the good argument that the Premier League and football at the top has become very commercial and corporate and against the average person has been misappropriated, as with many arguments in society, by the far right. I remember a year ago or so, a picture of some Liverpool fans at one of the games went viral because it showed a segment of the crowd, and it said, "Look at all these tourists; they've taken away the natural home of Liverpool." And it was quite a deceptive, insidious argument, because they'd taken a screenshot where you could see some people of Asian descent, of Eastern Asian descent. Liverpool has one of the highest British Asian populations in the country, and has always, as a dock city, has always had a very immigrant-based population because of all the people who've come and put their time and lives into the city, because it's a port, right? But the racist lens has allowed people to essentially say there are not enough white people in this image, therefore football's falling apart, and used the genuine argument of corruption and moneyed interest in football to launder their racist argument. And I think that is sort of what happens with a lot of so with the so-called woke agenda, because there's so much airtime and resource and platform given to these right-wing and far-right provocateur characters. Even when you try and make a good point, it will be immediately seized upon, immediately turned into a culture war. Oh, it's too woke, change what you're saying, and allow the racist element to pretend they have some legitimate point. The paper I read was about the taking the knee with Black Lives Matter. And it makes a point that there was some confusion with the messaging from the Premier League, because you can imagine there are several steps to get from the actual genuine protest and outrage at the events in America with police brutality to some corporate official at the Premier League saying, yeah, let's just make them take the knee and play some sound clip of a protest or something. And you can imagine some fans will think, well, why is this happening? That then is seized upon by people who use the already legitimate discontent with the Premier League to then say, well, look at all these woke things they're putting into football. They're not doing anything to address your needs. Therefore, you shouldn't protest and raise an issue with any anti-racist cause. Hence, then you get Millwall fans booing the taking of the knee and someone flying a White Lives Matter plane over a Burnley game. These incidents aren't the wider public attitude, but they can look that way when they're presented certain ways by media who are sympathetic to right-wing, increasingly far right-wing causes.
Yeah,
and equally, just to go back to the Sunderland shirts as we mentioned in the riots last year, that's not the prevalent Sunderland attitude either.
No,
as I think was trying to say, it's just you get a minority can tar the image of the entire group.
Oh, definitely.
I guess then the discussion is, how much should politics be involved within football? We would probably all be very keen on movements like Kick It Out and the taking of the knee and challenging racism and homophobia in the sport. And I was very much in favor when Gareth Southgate was kind of liberalising the image of English football a little bit.
But then again, he became a stick to beat him with. He's too woke, he's too soft and woke.
I do think that one of the best ways of creating a fascist is basically by calling someone a fascist who was just teetering on the end of fascism, because you're then disenfranchising them a bit further and angering them towards further extremism. I would find it disgusting to see Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage, far right actors, kind of their faces or their messages being waved within a football stadium representing my football culture. But at the same time, then we still want to have our kind of more woke messaging within football as well. I generally think that football is inherently a political thing. It doesn't exist within a vacuum outside of politics, and therefore we should try and make sure it represents the best form of our politics. But there is maybe a balance to play between disenfranchising people who disagree with you in football and driving them towards the extreme, and presenting football in its best form, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Dan. And the point I was trying to make was that we mustn't make wokeness. I know it's a stupid title, and I really hate it actually. And I think
I'm using it in quotes every time I say it.
Indeed,
I think we should reclaim it.
Well, maybe so.
We are woke.
But it's kind of just catnip for the culture warriors, isn't it? Because they point, like political correctness 20 years ago, they point to the most extreme versions of it. But I still think that educated middle-class people need not to be condescending. I think we've got to build a mass movement that involves people from all communities and all backgrounds, or the cause is lost. If people think they're being preached down to, if they think they're being told they can't say things, obviously you can't say overtly racist or awful things. I'm not arguing for that. But if we're too censorious and too exclusive in our bubble, that doesn't help either. It's how do we widen that out and make it a movement that everybody feel they can subscribe to, I think.
I also wanted to, and yes, I very much, I think I agree with you there, John. Although I am still in favour of, taking of the knee and these, yeah. We've been talking about the kind of the type of progress made in football, which may have just actually pushed overt racism more onto the chat forums or onto the social media and less in the terraces. I was reading a Kick It Out report earlier on, and actually last year's season they received the highest ever numbers of anti-discrimination and inclusion in a single season. So there had been it. So basically, the data shows a significant increase in reports of discrimination at grassroots level, up 25% from the previous season, and on social media, where reports have more than doubled. So we are seeing more reports of racism and discrimination. They did actually suggest that this could suggest that this means that fans are becoming more tolerant, and they're therefore reporting when they see discrimination more often.
There is that, I suppose. Oh, it's just old Mouthy over there. He always says that sort of thing. 10 years ago, nowadays, I sat near a guy at Whitdean who would make regularly. We'd make remarks that would not pass muster today, but people just sort of knew he would shout that sort of thing. And that would never, he couldn't do that now. He'd be thrown out at some point. So maybe it's more reporting, but maybe it is that we're spiraling backwards again.
I think it's the what you said at this a few minutes ago, Dan. Politics and football, how much of a sort of should they be in one another? I would argue that, as you said, and as we all sort of are probably hinting at, the two are almost one of the same, right? Mm. Like when David, you're talking about the England games and the chants that were sadly prevalent there in the past and still can be heard today. You know, you still get the national anthems booed, you still get two World Wars and one World Cup chanted at various, even when Germany aren't playing. Sometimes actually they just like to chant that. You know, and all the nonsense every year with the poppies, all the horrible Irish references to the Troubles. They're inherently political, because when you say we have a national team and we're going to go and play national tournaments, like, you have put the language of politics onto football. Now, because of that, in society, we face big societal questions of how are we going to move forward into this 21st century with the return of fascism. And so, you know, the inner left-wing ideologue of me will inherently link it to the capitalist structures and the structures of our wider economy. But for football, that means that it's an arena of cultural significance that's going to be impacted by those external pressures. So when we see a rise of social media abuse and you know, more incidents being reported at football games, in some ways that's because we now have a media platform, you know, a media surface that has more of that in it. We have social media sites bought by people who are actively in politics and actively pushing an increasingly radically right-wing agenda. And so combating that in football is the same thing as combating that in wider society. It will take, as you said, John, a multi-community approach to combat it across many different fronts, with zero tolerance for the actual abuse, but also communication and dialogue and involvement of all people. So, as you say, you can't have the sort of situation where, like, one official from the Premier League says, "Oh, racism's bad, and we'll call you bad and get rid of you," and then there's nothing done to address it. It also has to be looking at the various discontent within society. So, in terms of football, that's looking at why so many clubs have been basically left to rot whilst the Premier League has a party by itself, basically. You know, looking at, like, the Super League's a good example. There's an inherently left-wing argument to why it's bad to have a franchise version of sport. You know, what it's not good to say, oh, well, the best teams can go off and play with all the best players and have all the TV rights and money, and the rest of you can just toss around in the, you know, whatever's left, basically. Like, that's an inherently egalitarian, you know, collective argument to say, well, no, it should be fair and equal. Everyone should have a chance. But it's captured a bit by far-right people when the people who oppose the Super League are, like, the Premier League and their lawyers. You know, and it's like, well, where's the, you know, no one's going to be waving a flag for them, because at any moment they'll do the same thing. They'll charge you an extra £100 to watch their games. Like, it's got to be people-led. It's got to be a genuine community resistance to it.
I think people project their own values onto how they view football as well. Just similarly to what you're kind of saying.
Is it, dude? Football is intrinsically, or sport in general, it becomes it forces an us and them onto people anyway. As a social, as you're watching it, it becomes, I find myself becoming a more and more unreasonable person as 90 minutes progresses. I'm actually horrible at the end of a game. I'm not a nice person, and I am as blatantly us versus them at that point as I ever am in life. It's not a good look, and that's and international football. I suppose I become a mini nationalist during World Cups and during England games, and at no other point, well, England games in any sport, and at no other point in my life.
It's a really interesting point, actually. I've read another paper by Dr. Redhead. That is their surname, by the way. That's not
an interesting
but they looked at subcultural theory and the way that football as a expression of culture alternative to sort of general discourse for a lot of history allow those sorts of sentiments to set in. So certainly in the past, when football was heavily pilloried in political circles and was seen as the dull sport of the masses to sort of swim around in, whilst sophisticated society play cricket and play
rugby.
Higher class. Exactly, yeah. The sport of dignified gentlemen. Football was then sort of left as, rotting stadiums, violence and stuff. And so a lot of that sentiment is still carried over somewhat today, where you've got that attitude that, of course, football fans are going to think and act stupidly because they're of lower esteem in society. But on a similar point, nationalism and us versus them and football do have some crossover, because to some extent, when you are following and supporting a football team, you have put your faith and put your loyalty into something which isn't of objective status. It's just something that is, unless you like, it's not as though you're doing a maths equation where there's a definite correct answer and logic and stuff. You've picked this team because of some arbitrary, ultimately, decision. And so, to some extent, that does cross over with fascist ideas, like on a base level, because fascism requires you to say, I am of England, therefore I support the English, and I support all these similarly arbitrary. What's important, therefore, is saying, well, sport is an area which we suspend this usual reason, but we do it in a way that is sensible and fair. And now at the end of the game, we shake hands and we move on with our lives and don't discriminate beyond that. It's where that law, that unspoken rule of it's just a game, is destroyed by the far right and made into further political divisions.
I 100% agree with you. And I think, but I do also think that everyone projects their values onto football. So I feel like a lot of my love of my football club comes from the fact that they are scrappy little underdogs that have fought that now have, they fought from absolutely nothing to kind of then challenge the elites. And they're one of a group of clubs that are trying to stop the, someone's phone's going off.
Yeah, sorry.
Nice. They're challenging the elites. They are a club which kind of, I don't know. There's a sense of anarcho-capitalism in modern day football, where it's the free market seems to rule and money means everything in modern day football. And I like it when my scrappy little club proves that to be wrong in a way. And I think that's why, and so maybe that's a slightly socialistic way of like viewing football, but it's another reason why I always want decisions to go in football governance. I always want decisions to go away from the bigger clubs getting more power, whether that be additional substitutions, whether that be for PSR decisions, whether it be just the money that's flowing through football. I think I view...
Sorry.
But to Cambridge United fans, Dan, or Rochdale fans, or fans of Barrow, you're the elite.
Yeah,
you're
true.
The elite. And way out of reach of those kind of clubs like that, and always will be. And yes, fought right up from the bottom, very, very creditable. But you've joined the elite, and that's how it will be seen.
True, and I do agree with that. I guess my point was just the values that I think about football is just I want. It is my political values as well. It's representative of my political values, and I do think that if you do view the world in a nationalistic, tribalistic way, in which you want to other different groups based on, say, ethnic, religious, or geographical lens, that can maybe be only encouraged or heightened by football.
I mean, I think the point I was trying to make is I think I'm quite a reasonable person outside of sport and football and balanced and whatever. And yet I find myself in games being sucked into an us and them situation. Therefore, if you, as you say, if you are already of that mindset that there are groups of people who are to blame for society, you're not that far away from being
the adrenaline and machismo and antics of football have crossover, and it's going to attract some of the same sorts of people who might also be susceptible to that far right poison. It's just how society can manage it to ensure that people, how we can make sure we are not falling into those traps, and therefore.
So Owen, how do we, what going forward then? What do you think as a young person of color going to games and seeing probably more firsthand than we do? What are your opinions of how it's going to go moving forward? What do you feel?
I'm of the opinion that football is one of many things in society that needs to be helped in this regard. Like, I think it's very easy for like when you see the events at the European Championship finals where 3 black players miss a penalty and instantly it's pounced upon. That's more than just football. That's a societal targeting a black person for some perceived, millions of players have missed a penalty, and in fact, at every single penalty shootout, a player has had to miss a penalty for it to be won, right? So clearly, when some players miss, the coincidence that the last 3 to take it were black is just a coincidence until racist people turn it into, oh look, the immigrants have let England down again. So that is something of education. That's something of how media coverage and critical analysis. That's underlying racial tensions that have been in the country for many, many years. And so football, I think, needs to be part of a societal drive to fix it. And so in terms of how we do that, actions speak louder than words. It's economic in that we need actual funding for anti-racist things in schools, within football. There needs to be serious regulation on social media, and that's going to take a massive political effort, because obviously when you're up against someone like Elon Musk, who's actively palling around to, well, basically de facto president, really, isn't he? Because he's just basically been given carte blanche to do what he likes in the White House. So it is unfortunately going to be a big, hefty societal effort, but through vocal community resistance and opposition, through essentially refusing any space on the internet or in person for far-right people to feel comfortable. Like, you think one of the reasons that they don't go to Arsenal games and don't go to some other London club games, and like Liverpool, you'd never see in Anfield like far-right flags and stuff flown, is because they would not feel comfortable there. They don't feel at home. They would potentially feel they're going to get beaten up themselves if they start like showing some of that stuff. Whereas at the clubs that they've had more, for instance, some of the Sunderland shirts we saw, because there's not the same as vociferous anti-racist movements there, they feel more comfortable. And so it was quite important in the events after the riots for people to be out on the streets in public, opposing and counter-protesting and wearing the same shirts, but in a better light. It makes it harder for racist groups to then have the same presence, because now all of a sudden there's a vocal resistance and they feel less confident saying and acting in their way. And it will also take economic change too, because ultimately, whilst you still have the vast disparities, like if you've still got towns where there's just not any relief for austerity and the club is literally bankrupt and some owner has basically abandoned the club to die, like, of course people are going to be more susceptible to bad faith arguments about the Premier League being bad, and repackaged into that immigrants and black people being bad and stuff. Like it's got to be a multifaceted approach, I think.
And I think also reclaiming football culture back from the far right, and maybe utilizing it as a vehicle for inclusion and tolerance and coming together to celebrate sport, maybe even possibly for the left wing, that could be another way of challenging the far right and challenging groups like the EDL and the Football Lads Alliance, who think that football is for them. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm just interested, John, as you said, you go to many lower division games, and unfortunately, I don't really anymore because Brighton have moved into it for whatever reason. Do you still see overt racism at the lower levels? Is that what you're saying, or is it?
No, not really. Occasionally, you'll get kind of shouted comments, sometimes to black players or even black referees, of things like, well, F off back to London or something like that, rather than to your own country. Or
like dog whistle, isn't it?
Yeah, that kind of thing. But no, not overtly on the whole. And sometimes, actually, the atmosphere at those clubs, because they're fiercely proud of their town. The Lancashire Mill towns are something different because the level of racism and the level of division of communities in those towns in particular is pretty dreadful, actually. But other places in the country have been to sort of places like Hereford or to Blythe Spartans or to others. Actually, no, it's quite comfortable, and certainly racist shouting would not be tolerated, even down at that level at all.
And I think that speaks to the wider social progress, right? Like, for as much as it's, we can look at the world and think, wow, there's so many bad things happening in it. There has genuinely been massive progress made from, the dark days of football. I mean, you only have to go back to, the fact that an England manager can name a squad with as many players of many nationalities, and it's not like a headline saying Thomas Tuchel will name black players in squad. Like it's not. It's just accepted as like no one bats an eyelid. Like you name the squad, and you're not thinking, well, will the fans react badly to if I put a black player on in this game? Like, of course, it's been huge progress, and I think that needs to be tapped into as well. Most people do not care about the racial makeup of their team. They want their team just to win, and so they want good players playing. And if that player is good, then it doesn't matter whether what their cultural background is. And so the areas that, like you say, with the complex social realities of some of these places is the origin of the problem in football. It's not the football itself; it's the wider social issues. And with resources, education, left-wing action, reversal of austerity, like there's going to be things you can do in those places to make things better and more harmonious.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with you, Owen. I think that's a very good point. I also think that we should perhaps start to close up this very interesting episode. It was, again, slightly somber. I think we're all worried about the direction of travel within politics in the UK, perhaps, but maybe more widely in the world as well. And maybe we can hope that football can be a vehicle for progressiveness against these trends. But thank you all for coming. This has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you, Owen, for kind of leading a lot of that chat. I think you really did a lot of work for that. So thank you very much. I guess we're going to do another episode soon, right? And we'll have to think about a topic. So to our listeners out there who've made it to the end of this episode, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.